Well, I was Minister of Public Works and Transportation here in Costa Rica in the 70s. And at the time, there was the urgent need to build a highway to the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, to connect with Port of Limon. So we obtained a loan from the World Bank, and a firm, a consortium of engineers was in charge of making the design. And we required that an environmental impact study be made of the route that was chosen. That could have been through Cartago to Rialba, it could have been through Tibás, Guapiles. There were a number of alternatives. So there was the engineering firm, but they didn't have the qualifications, the experience for making the environmental impact assessment. So an organization here in Costa Rica, which was called the Center for Tropical Studies, Centro de Estudios Tropicales, where there were some distinguished scientists who could evaluate the problem of soils, of forest impact, and they came out with a finding that was most important. They determined that the route that was chosen through this huge forest that eventually was called the park, the National Park Braulio Carrillo, that was a huge forest around the mountain of Surquí. And they determined that the layer of vegetable soil was very narrow, not very deep, and that was resting on a type of rock, a kind of shale that was very slippery and very meteorized, very disintegrated. So that if the road was built through there and the loggers came after and cut the forest, the highway wouldn't last 2 years. The rains, and there are heavy rains in this area, would just wash away the soil and the whole thing will just collapse. So President Figueres was president at the time, Jose Figueres. I explained to him the situation, and he was in complete agreement. Okay, let's make a delimitation of over 1,000 square kilometers to save that forest, to prevent, to prohibit that the forest be cut by the loggers. And that's what was done. Maybe that was my first experience in nature conservation, and I think I learned the lesson because that was in the 70s. And when the 1990s, I became a member of the Board of Visitors at the invitation of my great friend Donald Stone, Dr. Donald Stone, a great scientist, a great botanist, a great gentleman. I will tell you how I got acquainted with him.
Yes, please.
Okay. My son, Carlos, after graduation, chose to go to study at Duke University. And as a freshman, he was walking through campus when he saw at a building a title that said, Organization for Tropical Studies, information available. Please come in. So he, a Costa Rican, knowing very little of the environment in Duke University, he went in and he was received by, of all people, Dr. Donald Stone. And Dr. Donald Stone spent with him about 1 hour showing him maps and graphs and literature of all that OTS was doing in Costa Rica. And very much to Carlos Silva's surprise, and also to my surprise, OTS, in Spanish, Organización de Estudios Tropicales, existed in Costa Rica since 1964. And it was founded in a land that used to be owned by the very people who made the Tropical Science Center. So Carlos became good friends with Dr. Stone, and they played tennis together and they chatted together, and Don Stone invited him to his home. And when he found, Dr. Stone, that Carlos's father was involved in development and in financing of development in Costa Rica and also in Latin America through the Inter-American Development Bank, Don Stone thought, well, that's the kind of people that we need for a board of visitors, which is equivalent to a board of advisors. So he invited me. I accepted to join the BOV, as it is called now, and I served in it from 93 to 2006, 13 years, at which time I retired. Well, I was old enough and I should leave the space for other people to come in. But I think that one of the contributions that I was lucky to be there to make was the building of the headquarters in Costa Rica of the OTS at the University of Costa Rica in San Pedro, where our good friends Dr. Gabriel Macaya, the former president, Dr. Pedro Leon, were very receptive. We made a committee. We went around fundraising. We raised over $1 million, and we got also donations and grants from the United States. So we built the headquarters, which is there, and I think has been very useful.
It's a beautiful building.
It's a very nice building. We got an architect that made a very nice functional design, and it has had very good people. And of course, being part of the BOV with Americans and Costa Ricans jointly, we made like a kind of a family to promote, to develop, to finance, to support the OTS. So we're delighted that after 50 years, which next year OTS becomes 50 years old, we're delighted that the organization has developed in such a way and has promoted to thousands of students, mostly graduate students, in research and education in environment. So we're delighted that we were able to participate in this great effort.
So how did you first become associated with OTS?
Our son Carlos went to Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And as a freshman, he was walking through campus and he saw a sign that said Organization for Tropical Studies and invited to come in for information. So he went in and he met, of all people, the very director of OTS, Dr. Donald Stone, a great scientist, a great botanist, a great gentleman who, from the early stages of OTS, he was one of the big promoters and directors. And to his surprise, the conversation of Carlos and Don Stone for over 1 hour, and they talked about nature, about the university, about playing tennis together, etc. They became very good friends. And through Carlos, Dr. Stone learned that Carlos's father was involved in development projects, economic and social projects, and that he was Minister of Public Works before, and at the time he was director at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington. So Don Stone wanted that the Board of Visitors, which is kind of board of advisors of the organization, integrated people who were in different parts of society, in development, in sociology, in administration, in financing, etc. So he invited me to Duke. We made good friends, and I became a member of the BOV, as it is called in abbreviation, in 1993. And I was member of the board for the next 13 years until the year 2006. Those were wonderful years because I became acquainted with many American and Costa Rican people who were geared toward saving nature, research, education, etc. And that OTS existed since 1964. It was not very well known at the time, but it had already 3 research stations, one La Selva, where we are today, in Sarapiquí, which is the tropical forest, one in Cotobruz, near the border with Panama, which is the moderate tropics, and a former botanical garden created by the Wilsons, and then another one that is called Palo Verde in the Guanacaste area near the Tempisca River, and that is the dry tropics. So OTS has 3 completely different climates for the 3 biological stations. And in those stations, thousands of graduate students have studied, made research, written their master's and doctoral thesis, and they're all over the world promoting the conservation of nature. So I think that is a great contribution that OTS has made to Costa Rica, to Latin America, and I would say to the world.
I agree with you fully. What was your involvement with the construction of the office and the building?
Well,
in
at
San
the
Jose?
time, in the 90s, the headquarters was Duke University, and here the biological stations, the 3 biological stations, were like appendices, but they didn't have a very strong participation. It was needed to have a headquarters in Costa Rica to connect with Duke and have like an axis of mutual collaboration. So we recruited an architectural group that designed the building. It ended up with a cost estimate of about $1.5 million. So there was the need to finance it. The University of Costa Rica donated the land at the campus in San Pedro de Montes de Oca. So we went about with the members of the Board of Visitors and the people that had some training in fundraising, and we raised $1 million. And in the United States, another $1 million was raised among Americans who sympathized with our effort and believed in conservation of nature. So the building was constructed and finished and inaugurated. I forget the exact year, but it was about the year 2000. Of course, the organization has been lucky that it has had excellent people, excellent directors. Now we have Elizabeth Lossos, whom we stole from the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, and she is doing a wonderful job. And we're delighted also that the biological station of La Selva is located exactly north of the highway that I mentioned at the beginning. The highway which study showed that the geological formation of the soil would carry a disaster if the loggers cut the trees from the forest. So I was able, being Minister of Public Works and Transportation, to persuade, and I didn't need much to persuade President Jose Figueres, that we make a reserve of 1,200 square kilometers of forest that would become a reserve that would be untouchable by the loggers, forbidden to cut a tree there. That was in the mid-70s, and then came President Daniel Oduber and his collaborator, a great scientist also, Álvaro Ugalde, who directed the conversion of the forest reserve into a national park. And that's the way it became Parque Nacional Braulio Carrillo. And Parque Nacional Braulio Carrillo, I think there are few cities or capital cities in the world that have a great national park like Braulio Carrillo just 20 minutes away from the city, for the enjoyment of the people, for education and research in biology, and which also forms a continuous of the national park with the corridor to the north that is called the Corredor Mesoamericano. The Middle America corridor is a biological corridor that incorporates also other reserves and national parks, goes all the way up to Caño Negro and into Nicaragua, and into Central America for that matter. So I'm delighted that I have been part of all this, but I wouldn't have done anything without the great collaboration of so many wonderful people that have worked for the Organization of Tropical Studies.
Were you involved with the declaration of the Zona Protectora between Braulio, between the lower border of Braulio Carrillo and the back of La Selva?
Well, this is a funny little anecdote. When we declared the forest reserve, it was at the end of the administration. And the executive decree that made the forest reserve was signed by President Figueres and myself the day before we left government, May 7 of 1974. And from there on, Álvaro Ugalde and President Daniel Oduber took over and converted it 3 years later into a national park.
Well, that's very nice to see two administrations working together.
Well, for his work in conservation, President Daniel Oduber received the Albert Schweitzer Medal for Conservation, the only Latin American who has received that high decoration, the Schweitzer Medal for Conservation. He received it in Washington at the hands of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, way back in 1977 must have been, at the Smithsonian Institute.
I know there's been a happy marriage between OTS and Costa Rica because of this very strong and very forward-looking conservation ethic and activism in Costa Rica. It's been a model for the students that come through OTS and a goal. I think they go back to their home communities with a goal of designing something that looks a lot more like Costa Rica and what Costa Rica has done.
That is correct. It has been a mutually beneficial two-way current from OTS to Costa Rica and also from Costa Rica to OTS.
Absolutely. Costa Rica sets a very high bar for conservation.